Hi, I'm Olney, host of the program To the Point, syndicated by Public Radio International and produced here in the studios of KCRW Santa Monica. Today, it is my privilege to moderate this plenary presentation entitled Ecological Economics for an Ecological Civilization. It's part of the Seizing an Alternative Conference. In the studio with me is John B. Cobb, Jr. He is the intellectual architect of the conference. He's also today's leading philosophical theologian and one of the first to bring together philosophy, ethics, religion, and the environment in a critical way. We are joined from his home in Maryland by Professor Herman Daly. He is a former World Bank economist, and he's considered to be the father of ecological economics. They are the authors of the groundbreaking book in that field, For the Common Good. And gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. It's a privilege once again, I don't want to repeat myself, but it is, to have you both on this program, and thank you very much for joining us. Herman Daly, let me start with you. Another presidential campaign is beginning here in the United States. It's a safe bet that every candidate is going to be promising an increase in economic growth and talking about the benefits of globalization. What's wrong with that?
Well, a lot of things are wrong with it in a full world. I mean, nothing was wrong with it back when the world was relatively empty and we could, occupy a continent and had plenty of resources. It used to be that the limiting factor in production was labor and capital. Now the limiting factor is remaining natural resources and their services. So filling up the world more it increases costs as well as benefits, and we don't really have measures of the costs. So it's quite possible that the costs are increasing now faster than the benefits. This is way beyond the radar screen of the politicians, and I think we need to improve our metrics of costs and benefits before it ever gets to their attention.
Those politicians often have distinguished economists advising them. Why is it that they haven't gotten the point that you just mentioned?
Well, that's a very good question, Warren. I've been asking myself that question over and over for quite a few years now. And I've had those economists as professors, and I've talked to them. And they're just totally committed to the idea of growth. One reason is the alternatives to growth are not very palatable. If you don't grow and you still have poverty, then you have to solve poverty by redistribution. That's an anathema politically. They don't want to talk about that. If you still have poverty, and then you have to talk about population limitation. Well, nobody wants to talk about that. And if growth is to slow down, or if you need to reinvest in the natural world, then you have to cut consumption in order to allow fallowing of the natural world, and that means a reduced consumption, which is also politically taboo. The idea that growth is still making us richer, indeed, it used to make us richer. But now it's very possible that growth is increasing environmental and social costs faster than it's increasing production benefits. And there's no recognition of this possibility, much less means of measuring whether this is happening yet.
So, John Cobb, what about the ethics of this? And if in fact economists, as you're both suggesting, are simply refusing to see the reality, where does that leave everybody else?
Well, my hope is that if the economists will not deal with the reality, that more and more thoughtful governments, not ones that are already totally sold to the economically dominant institutions, will stop taking their advice as the only place to get advice. And I do know that occasionally governments at various levels have sought advice also from ecological economists. So at least if ecological economics continues to be developed and becomes more visible, there will be the possibility of policymakers having a second source of recommendations. I put a lot of emphasis upon the power of the corporate world and the financial world because I think that's really the major obstacle. And I would say that in China, the obstacle is not as great. Now, there's still enormous pressure in China for growth. A new middle class is loving it, and they want to be sure they will continue to expand and improve. So the enormous pressure for growth. But nevertheless, in China, other measures are being used to evaluate provincial governors, for example, that take other things into account besides economic growth. And the Communist Party of China has written into its constitution the goal of becoming an ecological civilization.
Herman, back to you. Your goal, from an economic standpoint, is a steady state economy. What does that mean?
Yeah, this is an idea which goes back to classical economics. It's not something that I invented. It was a part of classical economics and most thoroughly developed by John Stuart Mill in 1857 or so. The idea is that you have a constant or non-growing population of people and a non-growing stock or population of capital goods. So these two physical stocks don't keep on growing, and you maintain them at a sufficient level for a good life by low birth rates equal to low death rates, so that longevity of people is high, and by low production rates equal to low depreciation rates, so that durability of capital and commodities is high. That's sort of the basic idea. Our adaptation of it today, we focus really very much on the concept, it's not a very great word, but throughput, the metabolic flow from the environment through the economy and then back to the environment as waste. This is a concept which has been absent from standard economics. For the past 50 years and even today, you pick up an economics textbook and in the first chapter, they show you the basic vision of the economic system. It's a circular flow from firms to households, households to firms. Households supply factors to firms, firms supply goods to household. It just goes around and around and around. Nothing enters from the outside, nothing exits to the outside. There is no environment. And so in that sense, the economy has been studied as an isolated system. So it's very much as if biologists were studying an animal and looking only at its circulatory system and abstracting completely from the digestive tract. Well, the economy has a huge digestive tract, and this needs to be built in to our economic models, and the costs of depletion at one end and pollution at the other end need to be built into the accounting and measured as a part of the costs and benefits of growth.
So, John Cobb, is it self-interest that has led to the de-emphasis of such an old idea as the steady state economy?
Well, I think that's a factor, but I think academic disciplines tend to establish principles and then socialize people into their acceptance. And the academic discipline as such has defined what economics is. And it is defined in terms of how you make the economy grow. So if you devote your life to studying how to make an economy grow, and then you were told, oh, you should have a different economics, it sounds to people as if that's no longer economics. I say theologians can get along without God much better than economists can get along without growth.
Herman Daly, what are the consequences of this? If, as you say, growth is now more uneconomic than it is economic, where are we headed?
Well, I think we're headed for increasing poverty in an inclusive sense. We're going to be losing natural wealth and the services of the natural world at a faster rate than the things that we're producing, than the benefit from the things that we're producing. One of the consequences that many people raise or suggest is that if we have a steady state, we're going to be poor. We're going to live in caves and be cold. I think this is not the case. There is still plenty of room for qualitative improvement, so that ecological economists make a big distinction between growth and development. So that growth is increase in materials, increase in physical size by accretion or assimilation of matter. When something grows, it gets bigger. Development is qualitative improvement. Something is getting better. The design or the efficiency is getting better. So if we can just change the path of progress away from growth, quantitative increase, towards development, qualitative improvement, and by that I include technology and the ethical ordering of our priorities, then there's enormous room for improvement in the art of living, as John Stuart Mill said, but without increasing this metabolic flow or throughput, which increases the cost of environmental degradation.
Is globalization the answer to that, in the sense that all the nations will cooperate with one another and perhaps even become one single world government ultimately?
Oh, no. In my opinion, definitely not. I think globalization simply destroys community at the national level. I mean, what do we mean by globalization? We mean basically deregulated so-called free trade, deregulated so-called free capital mobility, and deregulated so-called free migration. So if all of this crosses national boundaries without any sort of restrictions, then you've basically disintegrated the national unit, and there's nothing left then to federate into a larger global government. I'm not arguing that we don't need some global institutions of governance. We certainly do. But I don't think the way to attain them is through reducing the national state to nothing. I think what we'll end up if we do that is with a kind of individualism writ large, a sort of, how shall I say, feudalism in a global commons, a corporate feudalism in a global commons, which is not a global community in my view.
John Cobb, how do you feel about that? It seems contradictory. If we're all human and we're all pretty much the same, why is it that we can't all, as it's often said, live together rather than being broken up into separate, identifiable, self-interested organizations like nations?
Well, I think that we have been brainwashed by individualist thinking. In fact, individuals flourish in small communities. If you destroy the family and every infant grows up in institutions, the situation would just get worse. But we need community. I wish we could substitute from the notion of the individual the notion of person and community. Individuals become genuinely personal through relationships. Communities are groups of people who have relationships with each other. Individuals isolated from community live miserable lives. But one of the reasons that economic theory has gotten us into so much trouble is it focuses on homo economicus, simply as an individual who seeks individual advancement. And individual advancement is understood in terms of more goods and services for less labor. And this goal is just fundamentally wrong. One country in the world has repudiated all this and has declared that its goal is gross national happiness. And it turns out that if you look for the happiest countries and the happiest people, has nothing really to do with gross national product. It has to do with the quality of community.
Which is the country that has declared its goal is gross national happiness and measures it?
The Buddhist kingdom of Bhutan.
So, Herman Daly, we're not all Buddhist, at least as yet. Perhaps we ought to be, but we aren't. What are the prospects with diminishing resources and competition for them of before the ecology destroys itself, nuclear war?
Well, I guess that's the major problem, or that's facing mankind. The worst thing that we have to worry about would be nuclear war. That would end things very quickly instead of slowly. What's the relation, I think, between the possibility of nuclear war and this uneconomic growth? Well, I think that if we continue to grow, then we will inevitably be more or less at loggerheads with each other, fighting over the remaining resources. So I think the first thing that would be the first fruits of an effort towards world community would be to get off the growth path. So that would be a way of lowering the probability of war. That's what occurs to me. I don't see how we can have a steady state economy with war. I mean, so I think that should really be our first priority, to avoid war. And I think that's where we need to focus our global effort. We have very limited capacity for building global institutions. So part of my reason for saying that we should not abolish or weaken nation states too much is that we need a federation of nations to come to agreements to limit the possibility of war, as well as to limit the possibility of growth and runaway climate change and so forth. Those are truly global questions for which we really need a global governance. So I think our efforts should be focused on those at the global level and not dissipated on things that nations can perfectly well do for themselves without exchanging products over the world at tremendous cost in fossil fuels and so forth.
So, John Cobb, you're both talking about a paradigm change, obviously, and one that is not going to be easy to accomplish, it would seem to me, because of the power of self-interest. Are there ways of doing it?
Well, if people were really self-interested, they would stop trying to be totally individualistic. And that's why I think the idea of saying we should be seeking to make people better off rather than simply to increase the amount of goods and services is a kind of common sense that a lot of people can respond to. So if we developed our policies in that way, we would be changing things rapidly. I'd like to suggest the paradigm of the modern world was the Strasbourg clock. The clock on the cathedral in Strasbourg, every half hour and every hour had figures come out and dance around, and they looked very lifelike. And the scientists and the philosophers of the time said, you see, things look like they're alive, actually they're just machines. So the view that things that appear to be alive are really machines is the model. Now, self-interest built upon a model of that kind is a very narrow and self-destructive self-interest. So I want to appeal to people to think about their real self-interest. We are proposing now that a new paradigm might be Pando Populus. Pando is the name of the largest aspen grove, and Populus just means aspen. But a whole aspen grove, even though it looks like a lot of separate trees, is really just one organism. The root system is one common root system. And because of this huge community, if we use these terms loosely, this grove has lasted for perhaps 80,000 years. It may be the oldest living organism in the world. But even that is now being threatened by human intervention. And if we could think of the whole of our world in this way, that we're really bound together, that we're living, but that our lives are interconnected in such a way that we require each other in order to live well, and that we can support each other rather than be in conflict with each other, and then ask what is in the interest of each of the people. I think we come out with it in a very different way, and I don't believe we would try to reduce everything to lumps of matter in motion.
Herman Daly, you were at the World Bank, and your ideas there were rejected. What are the prospects of the kind of sharing that would be necessary to establish the sort of world community that you both are talking about, when there are yet at the moment such extraordinary disparities between the wealthy world and the world of poverty?
Yes, well, I think it's exactly that disparity that makes sharing totally necessary. And, in the past, we finessed that, and the World Bank certainly has, because the alternative to sharing is growth. The good old theory of the bigger pie. And that's what's been driving the politicians in the World Bank. But what we're arguing is that the pie can't keep getting bigger because it reaches a certain size in which it begins to destroy itself faster than it's expanding. And so this is really turned off. So the remaining alternative is that we really have to face up to the problem of sharing the Earth's resources, not just sharing with the poor, which is probably the first thing we should do, but also sharing with future generations and sharing with non-human life, which depends on the same world that we depend upon. So I think that's the key question that is to face up to sharing. Now, of course, that gets thrown back at us by people who say, aha, you're just a communist or a socialist, in disguise, and all of this green business is just so that you can work in your political agenda of forced sharing and government control and so on. Well, I don't think so. I think I've been kind of forced to this position. I'm not too fond of socialism or communism, and I would really resist being pushed too far in that direction. So I like to, but the facts are the facts, and the way the world is requires sharing, and it requires some institutions that will effect sharing, and I just think we need to face up to that.
You don't want somebody telling you what to do. You want everybody else to come to the point where they agree with you.
Well, that's sort of the rule of democracy, is that you don't want to force it on people. You want it to be democratically accepted and elected. So that's a hard thing to do.
What about technology? Does it have offer the possibility of increasing the size of the pie or changing the nature of the pie in such a way that it isn't as limited as what we currently have?
Certainly technology is a possibility, and we include that in our definition of development as opposed to growth. So development embraces both technological improvement and improvement in our ethical priorities, so that we do things more efficiently and we dedicate our resources to more important goals. So certainly technology is enormously important. I don't think that technology is a sort of deus ex machina or a savior that's going to come in and just change everything. We've certainly had our problems with technology, and one can list various technologies and wonder if they have really increased benefits more than cost. I wonder currently about fracking, about nuclear power, and various technologies which we've more or less jumped into in the quest for growth, for keeping growth going, which are, I think, likely to turn out to cost us more than they benefit us.
There are people who say that solar power, if we devoted enough, if we had enough of it, could in fact power the technological world. Do you think that's not possible?
I would certainly carry it as far as possible. I really don't know, the extent to which it's possible, but I think it's it's obviously the sun is our major source of energy for life, and so I get really upset when I hear people talk about these plans of blocking out sunlight so that you can burn more fossil fuels and have more room for thermal pollution because you're not letting the sunlight in. I mean, this is the most absurd thing I can imagine. And I think we should push solar energy to the maximum because we live off of the continual flow of solar energy. It's true income as opposed to fossil fuels, which is burning up a capital accumulation, which will disappear and cause a lot of other problems. So yeah, I'm a solar enthusiast, but I just don't know how far we can go with it. But let's go as far as we can, and then let's lower our consumption to that limit. And I'm not only solar, but there are other, there's conservation and there are many other things that can be done.
John Cobb, one of the things that Herman mentioned earlier with regard to moving toward a steady state economy and ecological civilization was population control. How does that, how possible is that, given the philosophical, religious, and ethical objections to it?
Well, two countries have done it in remarkably different ways, so it's not impossible, but that all depends on the culture. The Japanese did it at the end of World War II. And they did it, the Japanese are the one modern country that is also still tribal. And they can make decisions without voting, without governmental action. They just decided as a people that they would not have more than 2 children. And they have achieved pretty much of a steady state without any laws or rules. Of course, tremendous social pressure. If you have a 3rd child, you are almost a pariah. You understand, I'm not saying it's purely voluntary. I'm just saying they had a way of doing it. China, during the Mao period, large families were even encouraged. But the Chinese leadership recognized that China was overpopulated and continuing on that course would be a disaster. So in that case, there was enough power at the central government to enforce it. And obviously it was not totally successful, and there are horrible consequences, but there are probably 500 million people fewer on the planet now than there would have been. So we certainly can't say it's impossible to have population control.
But what about the religious, philosophical objections to that, particularly by people who say that this is interfering with God's will?
Well, I think they're wrong, and it's true that there is one biblical it's amazing how a single verse can then turn into the biblical point of view, the heart of the faith for some people. But there's one verse that says, "Be fruitful and multiply." Now, my view is that's the one commandment in the Bible we have already obeyed. We can check that one off, and we might start trying to love each other for a change. That would seem to me to be more fundamental to the Bible than the business of being fruitful and multiplying. So I think it expresses something really other than biblical faith, or different from being deeply religious. But there are people who latch onto that and make it a very central point. They are obstacles. We have to try to outvote them.
Herman Daly, back to the question of the steady-state economy. What would it look like, and would it be sort of eternal? Would it be something that would go on forever?
Well, I don't think it would go on forever. I mean, there's kind of a tendency in talking about sustainability to jump to forever. Eventually, this creation, it seems to me, according to science, is going to end. But it's not forever. It's for a long time. So I tend to think of the steady state as a system which lasts for a very long time, a high value on longevity, and we don't destroy it. It lasts as long as God wills it, or as long as the physical rules of the universe, which were built in from the beginning, will allow it to last. But I think it's a bit of a stretch to say forever, and it kind of, economists get pushed into theology rather at that point.
John Cobb, again, you're talking, both of you, in a way that makes perfect sense theoretically, and yet both of you have indicated very clearly that accomplishing the goal of the ecological civilization is extraordinarily difficult. Are you optimistic at all?
I'm certainly not optimistic. I really think the world is heading for enormous suffering. I'm just not willing to say it's impossible. Just throw up your hands and let it happen. So I think we have to keep trying. And whereas briefly in the early 70s, one could be optimistic. The public was aroused by Earth Day. Congress passed some splendid legislation, which is the only good legislation we have on our books. But at that time, then the corporate world decided that having people really concerned about environment and making drastic adjustments so as to have a sustainable society was not going to work in its favor. And so the newspapers and the media stopped supporting these kinds of concerns and supported something very different, and our politicians have since that time not been willing. They have been eroding what legislation took place at that time. So it is a humanly controlled fact that we are unable to make changes. And humanly controlled facts can be humanly changed. And I think that maybe the crises that we are facing will at some point be severe enough. It depends a lot on whether if the control of the media is still in the hands of those who don't want us to pay attention to what's happening. It's very difficult. But the web is not totally controlled yet. And it is possible to generate considerable bodies. And right now, I think there is a larger movement of effort genuinely to change things than there has been before.
So, Herman Daly, do you agree that the corporations are the villains?
Well, yes, to a large degree. I think it's also as John said, the media. I think when I was teaching students before I retired and I talked about all of these things and laid out ideas and the students would always say, well, yes, that's all of that makes sense, but it'll never happen. Nobody will ever vote. The Congress will never vote for any of these things that you're talking about. It's completely unrealistic. And I would have to say, given the corporate propaganda, it certainly is. And my only answer to the students is when they would say, why should we spend time on this? is that, well, at some point, there really will be a sufficient breakdown and crisis and a necessity to rebuild. And so it would be nice to have some ideas on the shelf when you get serious about rebuilding. I reluctantly have to agree with John about the power of the purchased media to just harp on the idea of growth and to not to practically censor anything else. But it's very, very difficult to break into the media on any ideas that oppose the notion of growth in GDP.
So are we fated then to have to wait for a crisis bad enough to get everybody to agree that it's time for the paradigm change?
Well, this is the answer I give to my students to justify making them listen to all the things that I'm telling them. Of course, I'm hopeful. I can't help being hopeful about the power of, what Boris Pasternak called the irresistible power of unarmed truth. You just present an argument, point to the facts, and eventually that'll get through, even if it has to clash with vested interests and other things. So, I mean, that's a fundamental faith that I have. But, I can't be optimistic. I mean, the evidence is not in my favor that this is that this is happening. It seems not to be happening. And so I hang on to it, but, I can't say that it's something that I'm optimistic about, just hopeful for the longer run.
John Cobb, what is your hope for the Seizing an Alternative conference that this is a plenary session for?
Well, one of the props that is holding people into the present mindset is the educational system. And the educational system has not always been geared to producing people simply for the market and simply helping them economically. And I think when you tell people that's what it is now, there's a certain feeling, well, maybe somewhere in our society we should be trying to help people develop as human beings, able to enjoy life more, to be healthier, to work together better in community, something like that. And there are still small colleges that work at that. And I think that there is enough dissatisfaction in many universities. You see, universities are now priding themselves on being value-free. That means they're, of course, up for whoever pays for. They'll do research on whatever anybody will pay for research. And they don't try to extract any kind of meaning or sense of direction for life or anything of that kind. But I find within the university enough concern about these things, and the university administrators, that if you can really present a comprehensive view that shows you can do serious thinking that doesn't follow these rigid disciplinary lines, which forbid any kind of self-examination, that an intellectual life can emerge that would be better than what the university now offers. So I think we might be able to make a crack at that point. I think that there may be a crack as ecological economics develops as an alternative to growth economics, because more and more people do know that our present society is not sustainable. And unsustainable means terrible, terrible catastrophe.
I take it you both hope that this conversation will go on for a long time.
Yeah, well, one also hopes that it'll come to a conclusion and in advance. It's already been going on for a long time, but I guess not so long in historical terms. I mean, we haven't really been facing these issues seriously for that many years, less than 50, I would say.
Well, thank you both. Once again, it really has been a privilege to talk to you, and I think we have begun a discussion that's going on for a long time. Herman Daly in Maryland, thank you so very much for being with us.
Thank you, Warren.
John B. Cobb Jr. here in the studio, thank you as well.
Thank you for doing this for us.
And thanks to you in the audience for joining us for this plenary discussion about the economic assumptions needed to help build a more ecological civilization. I suspect, as I indicated, that we've given you plenty to think about and talk about, and now it's your turn. I'm Herman Olney.